Thank you, Hans. Thank you very much. I very much agree with your words about the DSM University. This is the second time I've presented. The first time I presented on a policy issue. Today's presentation is very different, but I've also tuned into a number of the webinars as a participant and have found them extremely useful. Now, this webinar comes under the logic of DSM, part of the DSM University curriculum, and it is a bit different from a number of the other webinars, including the forthcoming webinars which look at particular mechanisms for driving energy efficiency or demand-side flexibility. Instead, today's webinar focuses on the context of DSM and for energy efficiency in particular. And it will explore recent changes in EU, so European Union energy consumption, and also have a sort of short-term outlook to 2020 and consider the implications for energy efficiency policy. Now, on this latter point, I will be very interested in the views of webinar participants, and so when it comes to the end of the presentation, I would really welcome your thoughts on the policy implications, not least because I found out today that I will be writing a paper on this topic for the ECEEE summer study. So yeah, please, I would very much welcome your views and the chance to crowdsource them for that paper. Now, a little background on the work that underpins this webinar. The European Union Commission funded me to report on an expert workshop on this particular topic. The workshop was held in May this year, and the report, which was then subsequently produced, draws upon the views expressed at the workshop, supplemented by my own research and analysis. So as such, I am very grateful to the Commission for supporting me during this webinar and to the workshop participants themselves, who obviously produced or supplied many of the views that I will be presenting today. And you can find the report here. I think it was in the pre-reading materials that came along with the information before the webinar today, but please do click on that report if you want to find out many of the details that I won't have a chance to go into during today's presentation. Now, the first thing we need to do is to set up the problem, explain it, and the European Union has energy efficiency targets, and those are set in terms of absolute levels of energy consumption. They're actually hard energy consumption targets, and those targets exist for both final energy consumption and primary energy consumption. And 2 years ago, the EU as a whole looked to be well on course to meet those targets. However, recent increases in energy consumption have put the achievement of those targets in doubt. And my first slide helps to explain that situation. So you can see here at the top of the chart that we have primary energy consumption in blue, and we can see that that's been generally going down over time. We can see a line of best fit here. And at the bottom of the chart, and be aware that the chart's being cut off at 1,050 million tons of oil equivalent, we can see here final energy consumption that has also been declining over time. And again, we have a line of best fit here. Now, the question that the European Commission were particularly interested in is why has energy consumption been rising since 2014? So, and I've circled the part here of the final energy consumption series, since it is final energy consumption changes that have been the fundamental driver of changes in primary energy consumption over time. So the European Commission were interested to know, is it the weather that's been causing this uptick in energy consumption since 2014. 2014 was an exceptionally warm winter year in Europe. If it's really just the case that winters have got a little bit colder since 2014, then perhaps there's no need to worry that there's been this uptick in energy consumption. Perhaps it's the impact of economic growth. So the EU economy has picked up since around 2013 and is currently growing above its trend rate of economic growth. So therefore maybe policy needs to work a little bit harder to offset the impact of GDP growth on energy consumption. Or maybe there's another explanation. Perhaps energy efficiency policy has become less effective, and therefore a different approach is needed to policy implementation. So those were the three factors that the Commission were interested in exploring. And of course the answer to their questions is that it's complicated. All these three explanations look to be playing a role, although the extent to which policy has been effective or not would need more information than certainly I had access to in producing this report. I think one of the conclusions of the report is that we do need better and more evaluation of energy efficiency policies. Now, let's now focus on this change, well, recent changes in final energy consumption. And to do that, I'm going to use some decomposition analysis. And I have used the Odyssey Mur decomposition, which is funded by the European Commission, amongst other funders, to look at the changes in final energy consumption and look at the impact of the three factors I mentioned. So the weather, the economy, and, well, gains in efficiency. You can't really use decomposition analysis to look at efficiency policy, but you can certainly look at efficiency gains, because what decomposition analysis does is it's a statistical tool, and it takes data series and looks at their changes over time and provides a weighting for changes in each of the factors analysed when looking at the variable of interest. And in this case, the variable of interest is final energy consumption. And what we can see here is that, and unfortunately my animation hasn't quite worked here, what we can see is three elements to our decomposition. So first of all, we have energy savings. These are the blue bars, and we can see that over time, efficiency gains have tailed off. So in 2011, minus 20 million tons of oil equivalent. So energy consumption was 20 million tons of oil equivalent lower than it would have been without energy savings. As we go on over time, those annual changes in energy savings have been reducing, and by 2016 they've reduced to around 5 million tons of oil equivalent. So certainly we can see that energy efficiency gains seem to have tailed off over the current decade. Now let's have a look at activity. So these are the grey bars, and by activity we mean changes in economic growth, so gross value added of services and industry. And in the transport sector, it means increases in travel, so passenger kilometres, and freight travel, ton kilometres. And we can see that since 2012, these have been rising, or the impact of these factors on energy consumption has been increasing until 2016, where the impact of increases in activity significantly offset the gains in energy efficiency. And thirdly, we need to look at the weather, or climate as it's called here. And that is unpredictable, not quite random, but almost. And in any given year, the impact of the weather may push up or push down energy consumption relative to the previous year. So we can see in 2011 and 2014, these were particularly warm winters, and the impact of those warm winters was that EU 28 energy consumption was significantly lower. Since 2014, we can see that the winters, because the winters have become warmer, because the winters have become colder, energy consumption in 2015 and 2016 has been pushed up as a result. And the overarching impact of both the warmer weather and the increases in activity has been to push up energy consumption, and unfortunately the gains in energy efficiency have been lower than in previous years. So overall, this is what is contributing to the significant increases in energy consumption since 2014. Now, we need to look, of course, in detail at individual sectors to get underneath the bonnet of these data. So let's move on now to looking at our first sector, which is transport. You may think that it's a bit odd to start with transport when we're talking about energy efficiency, but actually between 2015 and 2016, the increase in energy consumption in the transport sector was bigger than in any other. The main focus of the analysis was on road transport, given that it accounts for around 82% of EU final energy consumption in the sector. And the only major changes between the different modes of transport has been the increase in air travel over the recent decade, while other modes have remained fairly stable. And if we look at a decomposition analysis of the transport sector, and here I have just focused on two factors: activity, so that's the increase in passenger kilometres and ton kilometres, and everything else, because there is very little trend to observe when you split out everything else into its individual components. And what we can see is very, very strong increases in passenger and ton kilometres, and those are being less and less offset by other factors. Those other factors might be things like modal shift, which happens very, very gradually, but has not been positive with respect to energy consumption given the growth in aviation. Behaviour, things like driving styles, tyre pressure, passenger numbers in personal vehicles, all these things have been fairly stable. And then there are efficiency gains, and one of the results of the switch away from diesel vehicles to petrol vehicles since the Volkswagen Dieselgate scandal has been to reduce the efficiency of new vehicle sales, given that diesel vehicles require less fuel, 3% less fuel on average for the same car as petrol versions. So let's have a look now at some of the factors that are underpinning activity growth in the transport sector and think about whether those are likely to increase in the near term or not. And what we can see is that activity does look to be set to continue to rise. So we can see here that GDP, so gross domestic product, our measure of the economy, has been rising at a rate not seen since the early 2000s during the period from 2013 to 2017. And if we look at GDP forecasts produced by the European Commission only earlier this year, GDP is forecast to continue rising through 2018 and 2019. Now, what does that mean in terms of transport activity? Well, freight activity, which is ton kilometres, which are the series in grey here. These are highly correlated with economic growth. Understandably, we can see the big fall in ton kilometres around the time of the great financial crisis in the European Union in 2008-9, and the rebound as the economy picked up, not quite symmetric, but we would expect as GDP continues to increase that ton kilometres will also continue to increase over the period to 2019 and perhaps beyond. Passenger kilometres are also correlated with economic growth, although the relationship is not quite as strong. Clearly, more employment means more commuting. Discretionary travel appears to have a slightly weaker relationship with GDP. It's clearly connected, perhaps more to do with confidence rather than the actual GDP figures. And of course, energy prices also play a role here too. So let's take a look now at the evolution of gasoline prices in the context of changes in the wider economy. And on this chart, what I've done is I've put our different phases of economic growth at the top of the chart in this bar. So you can see a period of economic growth up until 2008, then the economic crash in 2008-9, a recovery from that crash or a partial recovery between 2009 and 11, then a recessionary period between 2011 and 2013, and then since 2013, economic growth. And we can see then our two series underneath that. So our passenger kilometre series are the orange dots. So you can see those rising initially, then being fairly stable over the period covering the crash, the recovery, and the recession, and then increasing again over the recent period of economic growth. Now, if we then look at our blue series, which is the weighted average price across the EU of gasoline, including taxation, so this is the prices paid by people at the pump, what we can see is that the fall in passenger kilometres during the recession coincided with a period of pro-cyclical fuel price rises. So the recovery was being offset to a certain extent, or the impact of the recovery on passenger kilometres was being offset to a certain extent by increases in fuel prices, whereas the surge in passenger kilometres since 2013 has coincided with both falling prices and economic growth. And since 2016, 2016 and beyond looks pretty similar to the situation that we saw in the 2005 to 7 period, where we see both strong economic growth and just gently rising fuel prices. One would expect to see a continuation in the growth of passenger kilometres over the coming period. So with activity looking set to rise, what about our offsetting factors? Can some of those factors turn back the tide of activity growth in terms of final energy consumption? Well, modal shift doesn't look great. Domestic and international aviation demand is continuing to rise as a proportion of overall passenger kilometres, and aviation is the most fuel-hungry mode of transport despite big efficiency gains. And the new passenger vehicle market has become more complicated in recent years in terms of its impact on fuel efficiency gains. So let's have a look at some of the trends in the passenger vehicle market. And I'm going to show you this chart. This comes from the ICCT, so the International Council for Clean Transportation. And the first thing to note on this chart is the 20% fall in annual new registrations between 2007 and 2013. This significantly slowed down the rate at which more efficient new vehicles complying with new vehicle CO2 legislation entered the market. Second thing to note, though, is that the long-term trend towards bigger vehicles, so this is the SUV and off-road segment, and this has accelerated during the recent upturn in new registrations since 2013. These vehicles consume more energy per passenger kilometre than the average new vehicle, and in addition, the small and mini end of the market, which consume the least amount of energy per passenger kilometre, well, they've not seen any pickup in registration. So what we're seeing here are consumer preferences changing and playing a big role in the new vehicle market. And while these vehicles, these bigger vehicles, may be providing new energy services, the result for energy consumption is that it's increasing. Now, the third thing to notice is on this chart, and this is the point I made earlier, diesel vehicles are losing market share. So the switch from diesel vehicles to petrol vehicles after Dieselgate broke in 2015 has led in key markets like France, Germany, the United Kingdom and Spain to really quite sharp falls in the share of diesel vehicles in the new vehicle market. And fourthly, on-road performance of vehicles, which shows up in the energy balances and final energy consumption figures, has not been as strong as test results would make one assume. Here's my final slide that uses ICCT data, and we can see here that over time, while the target for new vehicle CO2, which is highly correlated with energy consumption, was going down, and that's in black, the actual on-road performance as tested in the blue dot figure here at the top only declined at a much more marginal rate. So over time, the gap between on-road performance and test performance of new vehicles has increased, meaning that the impact of policies that should be reducing energy consumption substantially has been weaker than expected. So there are a bunch of reasons why the new vehicle market, which obviously feeds through to energy consumption over time, has not been the driver of energy consumption reductions to the same extent that one might expect. In the medium term, however, things do look quite bright. New test procedures, so this is the WLTP, the Worldwide Harmonized Light Duty Vehicle Test Performance Standards, are already in the process of being transitioned to in the EU, and motor manufacturers will need to incentivize the purchase of more fuel-efficient vehicles to compensate for the switch from diesel to petrol. Electric vehicles are becoming more and more accepted, and the switch in consumer preferences towards SUVs, however, will have a long-lasting impact on our energy consumption data, as the larger vehicles mean that manufacturers' targets are relaxed somewhat, given that they are based on the size of the vehicles to some extent. In the medium term, we should also look forward with some optimism to efficiency gains being made in the freight sector. I haven't really touched on this in this presentation today, but policy is now being put in place in the EU to deal with freight sector emissions. But now, bearing in mind time, I should move on to our next sector. And second sector to focus on only briefly is industry, because as we can see, it represents only a small fraction of the change in energy consumption since 2014. And what we can see is that while industry sector energy consumption growth does look to be fairly decoupled from output growth, we shouldn't rest on our laurels in this sector. Now, the freight activity story is to some extent being seen in the industrial sector. So production volumes in 2017, we can see here at the top right-hand chart of the chart in the blue line here. Production volumes in 2017 had still not reached their levels of a decade earlier, which the peak was here in 2007. But there has been some robust growth since 2013. Unlike in the freight sector, however, energy consumption has not picked up, so it does look like there's been some relative decoupling, and it was lower in 2016 even than it was 3 years ago in 2013. However, there has been some small growth in 2015 and 2016. So should we sit back and relax? Well, no, energy consumption is still rising, and it needs to fall by 0.5% per annum across the entire economy if the 2020 final energy consumption target is to be met. And given what we expect to happen in the transport sector, where increases in energy consumption look to be almost certain, that puts more pressure on other sectors. And if we look at the production levels in 2017, we see that they grew more quickly than at any point since the recovery year of 2010. So perhaps something around the structure of our production growth will mean that we don't need to be so worried about the industry sector. Well, this chart has got a lot of lines on, and if my animation was working, we would be able to focus a little better here on the dotted line here. This is the grey line, and this is the overall index of energy consumption. We can see that it's been rising since 2013. The thing that I would like you to take away from this chart is that between 2016 and 2017, all of the sectors shown on this chart saw growth. And so we don't really think that the structure of industrial energy consumption is changing in any great way that will be useful for the meeting of the energy consumption target. And if we look overall, the outlook is perhaps for continued small increases in energy consumption over the period to 2020. We can see here our decomposition for the industry sector, and we can see that in blue, here's our activity levels. So this is increases in gross value added in the industry sector. That's been increasing since 2013. Our structural series here is in orange. It's basically very, very small over time. Some years it's increasing energy consumption. Some years it's pushing down energy consumption. And everything else, so this is essentially our measure of both energy efficiency gains and changes in capacity utilization in plants and plant systems operations. Well, generally that series has been negative, so pushing down energy consumption, but it appears in 2015 and 2016 that it has not been having a particularly strong effect, despite the fact that in the European Union, I think it's fair to say that the European Union is a world leader in policies aimed at driving industrial energy efficiency and indeed has the highest take-up of the energy management systems ISO 50001 standard, in part driven by policies such as tax incentives in Germany. In the longer term, one would expect the growth in industrial energy consumption to subside somewhat because, as mentioned earlier, the EU economy is growing a little bit above trend at the moment. So one would expect that growth to subside and for energy consumption in the industry sector to be flat or to decline in the by the early 2020s. Okay, moving now on to the residential sector, which saw the biggest overall increases between 2014 and 2016. And in the residential sector, the key the key end use is space heating, which accounts for roughly 2/3 of energy consumption in the EU, a percentage that has declined a little bit over time, but space heating is still by far the biggest end use when it comes to energy consumption in the EU. Note that whereas some participants from hotter countries would see a big contribution from space cooling, in the EU that only represents 0.3% of residential sector energy consumption, although it is growing faster than any other end use. So the key chart here really is to compare the top two lines here on this chart. So we can see here that the blue line is heating energy consumption, and that has declined over time, relatively considerably, by about 10% since 2000. And the orange line, which is weather or climate corrected heating energy consumption. And you can see that that line has actually been flat since around about 2010, having declined considerably over the previous decade, so between 2000 and 2010. At the bottom of the chart, and again beware that I've cut off the y-axis at 80 million tonnes of oil equivalent. At the bottom of the chart here we can see other energy consumption, so that's the other third of energy consumption in the EU. We can see that's been rising by around about 10% over the same period. So here's another chart where I really wish my animation was working properly because it looks a bit of a mess. But the first thing to focus on here is the solid blue line, which is exactly the same line as is in the previous chart. So this is the weather-corrected heating energy consumption at the EU 28 level. So we can see it declining to 2010 and then being fairly flat to 2016. Now we can see that the countries that have seen the biggest falls in weather-corrected heating energy consumption are in Northwest and Central Europe, which is the biggest market for heating energy consumption, and the Baltic member states. But again, we can see that the fall was mostly happening in the period before 2010, and then since 2010, well, energy consumption has been up and down a little bit, but it's roughly the same in 2016 as it was in 2010. Looking around at the rest of Europe, we can see in Southern Europe, older member states, so that's Italy, Portugal, Spain, Greece, we can see that energy consumption has increased. Again, most of that increase happened in the previous decade, and the Eastern European new member states have seen some small changes in energy consumption, but not particularly significant since 2000. Nordic member states, again, also not too much change, although the Nordic member states do have the most energy efficient systems across Europe. So what's going on? Why have we seen change in the period to 2010 and not in the period between 2010 and 2016? Well, let's start at the top of this chart, and our Southern European older member states. We saw a 17% increase in heating demand over that period, in weather-corrected heating demand 20% between 2000 and 2010. And this was to a large extent owing to an increase in the number of dwellings. So there was a construction boom in this part of Europe, and also to the rollout of central heating in Italy. The reduction in energy consumption after 2010, potentially owing to the economic crisis, which suggests that there may be pickup in heating energy consumption in future as incomes rise. In Northwestern Europe, which is the biggest market, as I was mentioning, so this was roughly about 60% of all heating energy consumption in the EU is covered by the northwestern European market, so that includes Germany, France, and the Kingdom. Here we see that in that period between 2000 and 2010, there was a shift away from oil boilers to more efficient energy carriers, natural gas in particular, but also district heating. And we can see that in particular in the case of Germany. So in Germany, we can see here residential heating consumption shares by fuel, and we can see that over the period between 2000 and 2007, heating oil consumption fell markedly from, well, its share fell markedly from 36% to 25% of overall heat consumption. And between 2007 to 2013, that share remained fairly steady, whereas the share of gas and district heating, and indeed almost every other fuel except for coal, increased between 2000 and 2007, and between 2007 and 13, again, those shares were roughly similar, except for other, which includes biomass. So it seems that fuel switching was a big driver of energy efficiency gains in the previous decade, and energy efficiency gains since that fuel switching has happened have not been as strong. Let's have a look now at another market, Great Britain, and here the focus is on policy. So this is a chart taken from an impact assessment of the UK Energy Company obligation policy, and we can see here that our orange parts of the charts here represent the remaining potential for different types of interventions that save energy. So cavity wall insulation on the left, loft insulation on the right. We can see that the remaining potential for doing these types of measures declined significantly between 2010 and 2014, whereas solid wall insulation potential, which is a much more expensive technology, remains largely untapped. So what we see in the Great Britain policy scenario is the British, almost running out of some of the cheaper, more cost-effective energy-saving measures and having to move to more expensive measures that will save a lot of energy but are much more difficult and costly to install and therefore happen in fewer numbers. What about other drivers of energy consumption? What about energy prices? Well, it's difficult to pick up trends in the data here. So the chart on the left shows electricity and gas price indices, and we can see that these rose significantly over the period between 2009 and 2014. That's our blue and orange line. At the same time, we can see also our measure of household income, which has been rising more strongly since 2013 than in any time prior to 2008. I think what we can see is that while we would need to do some econometric analysis to really unpick this information, what we haven't seen is decreases in climate-corrected energy consumption as a result of those big increases in electricity and gas prices over the early part of the current decade. And we do know from the literature that price elasticities for gas and electricity are relatively small, i.e. changes in prices do not have dramatic effects on changes in consumption. On the right, we see a chart covering EU population growth. So the bars are annual changes in population, and the orange line is the total population in millions. And what we can see is that population, which is correlated with energy consumption, was rising faster in the previous decade than in the current decade. So what we can at least say is that population growth has been a weaker driver of energy consumption than in previous years. So neither of these factors seem to be particularly strong predictors of the energy consumption growth that we have seen recent. So just to finish on the residential sector, it does appear that the slowdown in energy efficiency gains, whether driven by policy or not, and it is very difficult to unpick that, does seem to have been a key driver of the slowdown in the reduction in weather-corrected energy consumption in the sector. Now, finally, we're going to focus on the yellow bar, which is the services sector. And here again, I will be spending relatively little time because there is a lack of data. We do have some information, although not particularly up to date, on the split between different end uses in the sector. And we can see that, again, space heating is the most important end use and explains, we think, to a large extent, why energy consumption has been rising in the sector since 2014. However, employment is also very correlated with consumption in the sector for understandable reasons, and we use employment rather than gross value added as our comparator here, given that services sector is not necessarily output sector or the value of the output of the sector that would be driving energy consumption. Rather, it's the amount of space that they require to heat in order to maintain their operations. And what we can see is that between 2000 and 2008, at least 2006, employment in the sector was growing robustly, as was final energy consumption. And then between 2014 and 2016, we've seen another pickup in employment in the sector. And again, that's been married by an increase in final energy consumption. So, conclusions before we move on to questions. First of all, strong and sustained activity growth is likely to push up final energy consumption in the short run. Both GDP growth pushing up industry consumption, but perhaps more importantly, passenger and freight kilometre growth is likely to push up transport energy consumption in the period to 2020. The weather poses an additional upside and downside risk to meeting energy consumption targets. 2016 was an average year for winter temperatures, so the data could go either way. Efficiency gains appear to have weakened during the current decade, and this is the real concern, I think, for efficiency policymakers looking to try and not just meet the EU 2020 target, but put in place plans for the 2030 target. The analysis in the paper was limited by the availability of data, particularly in the service sector at end-use level. Really need end-use level data to be able to make decent analysis of the impact of the efficiency measures. And on policy effectiveness, we could get more data on policy evaluations. This would help us to marry data from decomposition analysis, that policy analysis. So policy implications, well, clearly do more evaluation, for governments try and spend more money collecting data, particularly in the services sector. But for actual policy implementation, where it makes sense, ramp up policy ambition now, because it looks as though the 2020 energy efficiency targets are risk. However, don't put in place new policy that will end up that you will end up regretting. I.e., you need to focus on no regrets policy interventions and focus heavily on building the right policy framework for 2030 targets. And finally, more precise scenarios for future energy consumption could be developed through the combination of energy modelling and economic forecasting, both of which are done by different analytical disciplines. Better forecasting of energy consumption and better scenario development of future paths for energy consumption based on the levels of economic growth would have helped to have put what seemed to be very good progress towards energy efficiency targets in 2014 into context. So with that, I will stop and open to questions. I'm particularly interested in views of participants on their views on what policymakers should be looking to do as a result of this type of analysis, which appears to show that the 2020 energy efficiency targets are at risk of